Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the economic update, both on a national and local level, statewide. So today we have joining us two great economists, Dr. Jessica Lautz, Deputy Chief Economist and Vice President of Research at the National Association of Realtors. The core of her research focuses on analyzing trends for both NAR members and housing consumers through the management of surveys, focus groups, and data analysis. She presents new and innovative ways to showcase results. She effectively utilizes research data to educate and impact policymakers on the state of the housing market and discusses research findings in major media outlets and international presentations. In 2021, Dr. Lautz was named one of the Housing Wire's Women of Influence, a list representing 100 of the most influential women in leadership in the housing industry. In 2022 and 2023, Dr. Lautz was named a RISMedia Newsmaker in the Influencer and the Crusader categories, respectively. She also volunteers at Nottingham Trent University as an industry fellow mentoring real estate graduate students. Jessica received her doctorate of real estate from Nottingham Trent University in the United Kingdom. She also holds a master in public policy for American University and undergraduate degrees in political science and law and justice from Central Washington University. We also have joining us today Amanda Rector, who is the Maine state economist. As a state economist, Amanda conducts ongoing analysis of Maine's economic and demographic conditions to help inform policy decisions. Amanda is a member of the State of Maine's Revenue Forecasting Committee and serves as the governor's liaison to the U.S. Census Bureau. She started working for the state in 2004 and has been state economist since 2011. She earned a BA in economics from Wellesley College and her master's in public policy and management from the Muskie School of Public Service at the University of Southern Maine. Amanda is originally from Midcoast, Maine, and now lives in Union with her family. So I would like to welcome both of you and thank you for being here and dedicating your time to great agents in Maine. And also, what we're going to do is make sure that we're going to do any questions that you have at the end, and we'll do it through the Q&A portion of the Zoom, not through the chat. So if you have questions, we will answer them at the end through the Q&A. And we're going to start with the national forecast. And so thank you, Dr. Lautz.
Thank you so much for having me join you all today. It's great to be with you all again. We really are in a very changing market right now. Interest rates are changing, home prices still going up. But the one thing that seems quite consistent is the limited housing inventory. This is making it a very difficult market for home buyers. Homeowners continue to be in the winning seat as they continue to accrue housing equity. And I'll show you some data that really shows how they're able to dominate the market, making all cash purchases and having sizable down payments as well. So when we look at the housing market overall, I know that we are now in April, but it is worth noting that when we closed out 2023, that it really was the lowest home sales activity that we've had since 1995. That really has to do with the limited housing inventory that we had, both from underbuilding of new build inventory, but also the lock-in effect of interest rates rising from the lowest point that we ever have seen historically, dating back to 1971, to then doing a very quick rise in mortgage interest rates to the highest point that they've been in 20 years, means that a lot of people cannot afford the market today, even if their home is not working for them. As we look at the population growth, we know that the amount of inventory that we have in the market is really just not keeping pace with the population growth that we have had. So 336 million people in the US compared to 267 million in 1995. But the housing inventory is just 870 thousand in 2023 versus 1.58 million. So really clearly a problem there. All of that being said, because of the limited housing inventory, home prices continue going up, even though mortgage interest rates are also climbing, which makes it a pretty unusual situation as well. Home prices in the year at the highest point that we've recorded. When we take a look at mortgage interest rates, I know that interest rates have gone up, especially from that low point. That has created a lock-in effect when we think about the ability for a homeowner to be able to move. But I think it's good to place things into context as well. As we look at mortgage interest rates, they actually are a full percentage point below where they were at the height in October of 2023. Certainly a good thing. It certainly has allowed some home buyers to be able to afford this housing market, where perhaps in October they were really shut out because of the limited affordability constraints that they may have had. That difference of a few $100s a month does make a sizable difference for many consumers out there. The other thing that I think is helpful to keep in context, especially when talking to first-time home buyers, maybe just setting the context of what an interest rate has been historically. And if we look at that, the historical norm is actually 7.74%. So we're well under that as well by also a full percentage point. Helpful to keep in context that 2 and 3%, not normal, but 18% also not normal. So what is normal? And I think that can really set the table of if this was not looking at the past couple of years where we had those pandemic lows, people would be quite happy really having an interest rate in the mid 6% range where we have been since December. That being said, we know the lock-in effect is a real concern. As we look at the
Dolores,
household income, yes.
can I just interrupt 1 second? Because I
Yep.
know we'll probably get a lot of questions about it. Thank you. These slides will be available. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. So these slides will be available to all of you, and we'll have it also in our e-news later this week. So just so you know, the slides are available for both presentations. Thank you. I apologize.
Oh, no, no. Thank you for saying that. I should have said that at the beginning as well. So thank you. Yep, I will send my slides over right after this as well. So they can be distributed. So as we look at the household income of recent home buyers, we know that has gone up pretty drastically in just 1 year. For first-time home buyers, the median household income jumping by nearly $25,000. For all home buyers, jumping by nearly $20,000. And what that means really is not everyone got a raise in the last year who purchased a home. They may have, and that could have propelled them into home ownership. But what it really means is that we're really leaving behind communities of school teachers and firefighters, those who we need in our communities, really need those individuals. But unfortunately, they're not able to afford their local communities because of the rise in home prices in conjunction with the rise in mortgage interest rates. As we look at the housing market, though, I want to give you some good news here. I would be very concerned if there was not housing demand when we look at the housing market today, but there is plenty of housing demand. There are a lot of people who want to purchase a home, who want to enter into homeownership. And as we look at the market today, we actually know there's 2.7 offers for every home that's listed. That is very difficult for a first-time home buyer, but it is a good thing for sellers out there, even in the dead of winter, to see this number on a nationwide scale. And I know you'll have local statistics as well, placing greater context to this. When we look at the housing market overall, we're also seeing a third of home buyers are paying all cash, meaning they don't care about mortgage interest rates. All of the talk that I previously had, they're not impacted by this. And so they have earned a tremendous amount of housing equity. The typical homeowner has been in their home for 10 years, and they have $200,000 in housing wealth that they're sitting on. So that is a very sizable down payment if they were to move forward. But we also know there's a lot of all cash purchases for people moving longer distances as well. Longer distance moves do outperform on all cash purchases. But if we look at who's making an all cash purchase, we actually know a quarter of primary residence buyers who are repeat buyers are making all cash purchases. We know more than half of vacation buyers are making all cash purchases, and more than 40% of investors are making all cash purchases. So across the board, regardless of the intent and the use of the home, we know that all cash purchases are happening at higher rates. And in fact, this is the highest share in a decade of all cash buyers. So it is quite sizable. The other thing that I would say is good news too, is that for anyone who has worked in the real estate market back in 2008 and 2009, you'll know this, you'll feel this, you'll remember this. But at that time period, half of realtors were working with distressed sellers. Today, we just don't see that activity in the marketplace. While it's gone up 3%, we're still seeing low single bouncing around 1, 2, 3% on a monthly basis for multiple years now. And that really has to do with the high amount of housing equity that people have, that even if there was a shock within that household, they likely would be in a fortunate situation where they could move equity, rent on a temporary basis, perhaps move in with family, but they would have options at the table that would be helpful for them. All right, I want to go through a few demographic changes here as well. I think it's really helpful to understand where we could see demand coming from into the housing market as well. So as we look at the US population overall, we do know, uh, looking at the US population, so this is all the little kiddos born in the last couple of years in the green, and then we have the silent generation. The bars get shorter because unfortunately folks don't, mortality rates, we'll just leave it at that. Okay, so if we look in the middle of the chart here at millennials, we can see visually that they are the largest generation in the US period. So this is not home buyers and sellers, it's just generation. As we look at this, first red bar is the median age of 35 years old. That's the median age of a first-time home buyer today. That's towards the oldest that we have ever seen a first-time home buyer. In fact, if you look back in the 1980s, the median age of a first-time home buyer was just 28 years old. So this has increased pretty dramatically. As we look at that median age, really helpful to understand that on a personal level, they probably are not earning that housing equity because they purchased at a later point in their life. They may be skipping that entry level property. So not purchasing a smaller condo, moving into a single family home because they're at a different point in their life as well. That's apparent as we think of a 35-year-old versus a 28-year-old. Also really important here as we look at this chart is that when we look at the pressure that can be coming and placing into the housing market, the demand that could be there, the biggest population that we have in the US, the most popular ages to be actually are late 20s to early 30s. The exact age that someone could be purchasing a home, would want to purchase a home if the inventory and affordability were there for them. The other demand that's going to be coming down the pike in a few years is when we look at Gen Zers, and we can see a little bubble right there as well of population. They're also going to be putting pressure into the housing market soon as well. So as we think about building more inventory, adaptive reuse, bringing in new inventory, these young adults are going to be coming into the housing market and putting pressure in the housing market. They already are. And that's also pushing up home prices. The other red bar that I'll point out here too is the median age of 58. That's the median age of a repeat buyer today. And at 58, that's towards the oldest we've ever seen a repeat buyer as well. In fact, if we look back in the 1980s, the median age of a repeat buyer was just 36 years old. So we can see a dramatic shift here in what that person may want from their home, what they need from their home. Also, we know that they plan on, I'm going to say it, aging in place, because if someone's purchasing a home at 58, they plan on being there for 20 years. That's 88 years old. I'm just going to leave it there. But that to me seems aging in place. They really don't have an intention of moving. What becomes really important as we think about the housing market as well and demand is that this year in 2024, even the youngest boomer is going to be turning 60 years old. So 60 or older are the boomers. As we think about them, at 60 years old, I think that's a critical juncture in someone's life to be thinking about, where do I want to be in retirement as I plan ahead? If I'm not already have that all sketched out in my dream, then where do I want to be? Is it here? Is it somewhere else? Is it close to the grandkids? We know the number one motivating factor to sell a home and move is to be close to friends and family. And if that's the number one motivating factor, and baby boomers are the biggest generation of sellers today, we know that there's a lot of that going on, a lot of moving closer to the grandkids going on. All right, Gen Xers, didn't talk about them, talk about them on this chart. They're the purple, so I'm keeping the colors exactly the same here on this chart, but we can see the purple is very steady in the housing market. It's about a quarter of home buyers overall. In the last year, this is a really interesting shift that happened. For 8 years solid, millennials were the biggest generation of buyers. Last year, they dropped down, really had a lot of struggles entering into the housing market. And this year, they have rebounded, pushing boomers down, though baby boomers, the biggest generation of sellers again. The other big takeaway I want to have from this chart too is that Gen Zers, who are the younger adults, they are 18 to 24 as home buyers, as a generation as well. So as we're seeing them come into the housing market, they are coming in as single digits, but it is important to note that they are sneaking into the market, doing so with mom and dad's help, doing so with family support, moving from mom and dad's home, but they are coming in. There's a lot of fodder and talk about Gen Zers right now as this new young adult generation. And I think it's important to note that they want home ownership. It's their American dream. And a lot of them learned from millennials. And so they've learned about the mistakes that millennials made. And we can say wrong or right, but regardless, they do want homeownership and they are coming in. Couple more demographic things. Seeing a greater share of single home buyers in the market, so single women, steady on single men, but we're seeing fewer married couples. That's going to impact affordability. It's going to impact buying power because if you have a dual income, then you're going to have the greater ability to save for a down payment, pay down student loan debt, get that money in reserves, and be able to compete in the housing market where there is limited housing inventory. We are seeing more unmarried couples. So a good question that I get a lot is, well, people are delaying marriage. Is this impacting the ability to buy? Possibly, but we're seeing more unmarried couples. So perhaps they'll just get married later. Perhaps they won't. Regardless, we're seeing more of them in the market as well. We're also seeing more roommates. So people just perhaps pooling their incomes in different ways than they have historically. We're also seeing a drop in the share of home buyers who have a child under the age of 18 when they go to purchase a home. So back in 1985, 58% of home buyers had a child under the age of 18 when they purchased. Today it's just 30%. Why? Well, we see more repeat buyers and those repeat buyers are older. So that's going to shift that home buyer composition, who's living in that home, what they need out of that home. So schools have actually moved down on the priority list of being close to that perfect school district because people don't have kids necessarily in their home. If they have kids, absolutely, that's number one priority. Not number one, but it's up there on the list, right? You're not going to sacrifice school quality or school distance, but we know that there's fewer people who do have children. All right. Oops. Okay, back to the office trends, just a couple migration trends here. I say back to the office, but this has to do a lot with retirees, where people want to live, housing affordability. We are seeing migration into your state. This is 2022 data. I'm using census data here. I'm not sure if we'll have better local data from the next economist, but hopefully she does have better local data because this is what I have currently. What I can say though is that people are moving, and a quarter of home buyers in the last year moved 500 miles or more. So there are long distance moves happening at higher rates than we have seen historically. The other thing I'll say is that when it comes to technology, making sure that virtual tours, that videos, that floor plans, all of that stuff up to date. And the reason why I say that is in last month, 1 in 10 buyers worked with a realtor to actually purchase their home physically sight unseen. Quite important as we think about how the market has shifted, sticky trends coming out of the pandemic. What is important to home buyers when viewing that home? Couple slides here. We are in a lot, there is a lot of things going on in the broader real estate world aside from the real estate economics. Clearly, if we pick up any publication right now, media publication, we can all see that. And there's lots of communications going out about it, but I just want to underscore how much ownership does matter at the end of the day. We know that the wealth that is built from homeowners versus renters is 40 times. We know that homeowners have nearly $400,000 in wealth. A lot of that is housing wealth. and renters have just over $10,000 in net worth. That net worth can be used for a multitude of things, like remodeling, sending their kids to college, their own nest egg for their retirement and their future. Lastly, with the proposed settlement, I will say that one of my biggest concerns as we look at this is VA buyers, first-time home buyers, minority home buyers, all of these buyers being able to pay and move forward in a transaction, especially knowing that with VA loans, they are prohibited from paying for buyer compensation. And so as we look at this, we know that 10% of first-time home buyers actually did use a VA loan. So something our advocacy department is working closely with HUD and the administration to try and find a solution to this. But this is a concern at the table right now. There is a lot of real big attacks on the industry right now by the media. I just want to underscore how much you matter to buyers. And as we look at this data, 9 in 10 buyers are using agents in their real estate transaction. They want your assistance. They want your help. It's not just first-time home buyers. It's also repeat buyers who haven't done this in 10 years who really do need your help. And we know that buyers had a good transaction and a good experience with you because they want to refer you. So the number one way that buyers find their agent is through referrals or just going back to the same agent they've used before. We know that agents are finding the vast majority of their business as they've been seasoned agents is building up their clientele and building up their niche in the market and their reputation. As we look at sellers, 9 in 10 sellers are using a seller's agent. They want their seller's agent to do literally everything from pricing that home correctly, telling them how to fix up that home for sale, marketing the home, finding the qualified buyer, and then getting them to that closing table. A full service agent is the most popular agent being used today. And there's lots of different business models out there. All right, that is all I have. So I'm happy to turn it over to your local economist to share more local data as well. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And we're going to turn it over to Amanda Richter.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me pull up my slides here. All right. So I am going to talk more about the local level here. And I'm going to start out with demographics because that is really important to understand when you're talking about the economy. And I do have, in fact, more recent migration data. So this is sort of a quick rundown of the components of population change for Maine. You'll remember we had pretty slow population growth for the state from 2010 to 2020. That decade, the population only grew 2.6%. But then, of course, during the pandemic, Maine became much more popular. A lot more people wanted to move here. So we saw a lot more migration, which boosted our population growth. So we've actually seen 2.4% population growth just from 2020 to 2023. And all of that is coming from migration. We have natural decline. So we have more deaths than births each year. You can see that if you look at the chart, the red section is larger than the green. So in 2021, we had very, very strong migration into the state. Most of that was domestic migration. There was a little bit of international migration. It was positive, but it was pretty small. That's people moving directly to Maine from other parts of the world. The bulk of it was that darker blue. That's domestic migration, people moving to Maine from other parts of the US. We were actually 5th in terms of our total net migration rate in 2021. If you look at 2022, we saw a little bit more international migration, a little bit less domestic migration. Overall, still very strong and more than enough, again, to offset that natural decline. We were 9th in the US for our net migration rate. And then everybody wanted to know what was going to happen in 2023, because that really was the return to more normal population growth patterns and migration patterns nationally. So 2023, you'll notice that migration is smaller numerically. That blue bar, dark blue bar is smaller. International migration held up pretty strongly. But if you look at the rates, we actually were 9th again in terms of the net migration rate. And so we still, on a national basis, we're seeing a pretty good inflow of migration relative to our overall population. If you look around the state, this is just 2023 now. Knox County was the only county to see pretty significant population decline. Hancock County was really just right on the line there. It was negative, but just by a handful of people, essentially. I think it's interesting that Knox County is at the low end. Waldo County, which is right next to Knox County, is on the high end in terms of population change. And you'll notice that some of the counties there with the larger blue bars, that's the migration piece again. Piscataquis County, Oxford County, Franklin County, and then Waldo County. Some of those are quite rural counties, Piscataquis County in particular. So still seeing good migration rates into the more rural counties. I will say that if you look at the cumulative period from 2020 to 2023, all of the counties saw population growth, even Knox County, which is had started to tip negative because of that much smaller migration rate. I suspect that lower migration rate is probably related to the availability of housing in the area. I live in Knox County, so I have some on the ground observations there. Maine does have the oldest median age in the nation, and we also have the highest percent of the population age 65 and over. So we have the largest share of baby boomers in our population of any state. If you look around the state, there are a few counties where the median age is a little bit lower. So Androscoggin County, Penobscot County, Cumberland County, Kennebec County, and then York County and Franklin County are sort of just over the line there. Those counties tend to be our more urban areas or close to the more urban areas. And then they also have larger college and university populations. And so that brings the median age down in those regions, as opposed to Lincoln County and Piscataquis County, which have the highest median ages up above 50 years. But with that migration into the state, in 2021, Maine was actually one of only 2 states where we saw a decrease in the median age. Connecticut was the other one. And then 2021 to 2022, we were one of only 4 states that didn't see an increase. So that migration into the state was younger populations, at least younger than the existing population in the state. We also have some diversity in the state. I want to point out all the counties have some diversity, but overall, we do have the lowest diversity index of any state in the US. So it was 18.5 for Maine. The US was 61.1. The diversity index basically just says if you're taking 2 people at random from the population, what are the chances that they're coming from different racial and ethnic backgrounds? So Cumberland County, Androscoggin County, and Washington County have the highest diversity indices in Maine. Cumberland County, Androscoggin County have higher shares of Black or African American populations. Cumberland County also has a higher share of Asian population. And then Washington County has a higher share of Indigenous Native American population. What I think is interesting, though, is that if you look at the diversity index by age, you can see that the younger generations are more diverse than the older ones. So the generations that we have coming into our school system and then hopefully into the workforce are more diverse than the existing population and the population that is aging out of the workforce. So I want to touch just briefly on the housing piece of it. I didn't want to go into this in any great depth. Dr. Laus did a great job of covering all sorts of different pieces from the national side, but I do think this sort of complements what she was presenting. This is the affordability piece of this, essentially. So this is coming from Maine housing data. This is back in 2020, so before the migration started into the state, really. And you can see that there were a handful of counties that were considered affordable. Those are the ones in green, Aroostook, Piscataquis, Somerset. So the more rural counties were considered affordable. And then the counties in red were considered unaffordable, with Lincoln County, Cumberland County sort of maxing out around 60% of households unable to afford the median home. If you look at what happened during the pandemic with people moving in, more demand for housing, that really limited availability, very low supply of inventory, contributing to those price increases, we saw this really sharp increase in unaffordability. So 2021, there were only a couple of counties that were still affordable, Aroostook County, Washington County. 2022, you can see that really big jump. That's when prices really took off. None of the counties were affordable anymore. And then 2023, if you look down at the bottom here, you can see Lincoln, Knox, York counties closing in on 90%. And then Aroostook County is just over that 60% mark. Remember, that was the high water mark back in 2020. It's now where the lowest county is in terms of affordability. So this has been really significant impacts in a very short period of time. I think that, the good news on this front is that everybody is recognizing this as an issue. And so there are a lot of people who are working on trying to come up with some solutions to this. One of the reasons that it's so important is that we want to continue to see people migrate into the state because we need more people to fill the workforce. So if we look at the total labor force for Maine, this goes back all the way to 1947. You'll see the first thing that jumps out is that really rapid period of increase that took place from the mid to late 60s through about 1990, when the baby boomers were aging into their prime working years. We saw pretty strong migration into the state, mostly of baby boomers, and we had women joining the labor force in much larger numbers than they had previously. And then it was still growing, but at a slower rate. Excuse me, and then it leveled off, and actually more recently we've started to see the labor force trend downwards as the baby boomers are moving into their traditional retirement ages. So if we look at the overall labor force participation rate for Maine and compare it to the US, Maine is in blue, the US is in orange. You'll notice if you go back 20 years, 2004, 2005, for quite a long period actually, Maine was above the US in terms of the overall labor force participation rate. And then pre-pandemic, around 2018, 2019, we flipped and our labor force participation rate was a little bit lower than the US. And then everything went haywire during the pandemic. The US has started to creep back up again, slowly but surely. Maine, we saw a big uptick and then a big downtick. And we've really opened up a really wide gap there between the US and Maine. And so everybody looks at this and says, what on earth happened? Where did everybody go? What happened to our labor force? Well, it really is just a reflection of the age of our population. If the age distribution of Maine's population was the same as the US, our overall labor force participation rate would actually be about the same as the US. In fact, if you sort of draw a line through that trend for Maine, you can see we're pretty close actually to where you would expect us to be if you just leave out the pandemic period. So it really is a reflection of the fact that we have that older population. More of our population is aging out of the workforce than aging in. And that really has impacted our overall labor force participation rate. It really is a matter of we don't have the same demographics that the US does, bolstering that. At the same time that we have that shrinking labor force, we have these really low unemployment rates. So we were 3.4% in February. It was a little bit higher than some of the record lows that we saw recently, but it was holding steady for the 5th consecutive month. If you look at the county level data, this is not seasonally adjusted, and February tends to be one of the highest months for unemployment rates. If you look down through them, though, they're all still pretty low. Piscataquis County up around 7.2%. That's the highest. It is quite a bit higher than it was 1 year previous, but those are still pretty low rates. We do have some variation where the sort of southern, coastal, and central portions of the state tend to have lower unemployment rates than up around sort of what we think of as the rim counties and some of the more rural parts of the state. So this has led to a very, very tight labor market overall. And you can see this if you look at this ratio of unemployed persons to job openings. You can see if you are above that dark line there at 1.0, there are essentially more unemployed persons available for work than there are job openings. So workers are plentiful. And you can see we were in that position for a very long period of time. That most recent spike there was the pandemic, of course, when we saw a lot of people who went into unemployment and then very quickly came back out of it when everything opened back up again. But even before that, and now more recently, we've been in the opposite situation where there are more job openings than there are available unemployed workers to fill them. In fact, we're running around 2 job openings for every 1 unemployed worker. So all of that put together means that it is a very, very tight labor market. It is very hard for businesses to find the people that they need to fill their job openings. One of the reasons why we want to see migration into the state continue, preferably of those younger working age populations. So the state has a Consensus Economic Forecasting Commission that does the official economic forecast for the state. My office provides some staff support to them in developing their forecast. And then they turn their economic forecast over to the Revenue Forecasting Committee that I sit on, and that sets the official revenue forecast for the state. So this is the first piece of that. If we look at total employment, you can see we did manage to get back to our pre-pandemic peak in the summer of 2022, and we continued to grow since then. And then the forecast here is for sort of this plateauing growth in the future. It's still growing, but it's growing very, very slowly. That is, again, a reflection of our demographics and that very tight labor market. In order to add new jobs to the economy, you need people to fill those jobs, and we just don't have them. I will point out that one of the assumptions that the commission is operating under is that we will continue to see migration into the state. They did change one of their assumptions. If you read their report, they changed one of their assumptions where previously they had anticipated that there would be more than enough people coming in from migration to offset the retirement of baby boomers. They've tempered that a little bit, and they said in the future that may not be enough. So we may see that employment forecast start to dip down in future years as we run out of people, essentially, to take on the positions that are being vacated by folks who are retiring. So I want to talk just a little bit about wages and income. Of course, as we had a very tight labor market, we saw a lot of upward pressure on wages. If you look at the blue line here, that's just current dollar average wage. You can see it looks like it just increased pretty steadily, and then the pandemic hit and it really accelerated and has not really gone back to its previous pace. If you look at the orange line, that's after we've adjusted for inflation. And you can see we're actually just sort of holding steady for a very long period of time. And then when inflation was very, very low and we had upward pressure on wages, we started to see a bit of an increase pre-pandemic, very sharp increase during the first part of the pandemic. And now we've just been holding steady again. So we're just keeping pace with inflation. Now, that's pretty impressive given how high inflation has been recently. But it means that what looks like real gains, once you take inflation into account, are not actually real gains. It's just holding steady. So the forecast, again, coming from the Consensus Economic Forecasting Commission, this is total personal income for the state and wage and salary disbursements after adjusting for the inflation forecast. You can see 2020, we actually had wage and salary growth. And then on top of that, we had a lot of growth in things like unemployment benefits and stimulus checks that went out. So we had a really big increase in total personal income that year. 2021, more stimulus checks, wage and salary growth was stronger. So both of those grew. 2022, inflation jumped up. We saw all of those federal packages unwind. And so if you look at total personal income in real terms, it actually declined that year. And then 2023, we should, as inflation eased and we saw stronger growth again, we sort of returned back up. And then 2024 is sort of the start of this very level period here, where wage and salary disbursements and total personal income are running pretty much just at sort of what we think of as some historical average rates here after taking inflation into account. So I'm going to wrap up with a few things to keep in mind, and then we can get into the Q&A section. So I just want to touch on this again, and Dr. Lautz talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but we really saw that increase in housing costs with lots of demand for housing, very limited supply. And then we saw those interest rate hikes that made the mortgages more expensive, locking people into those existing lower rate mortgages, locking up more of that available inventory. Hopefully we will see some improvements in the future. We're starting to see interest rates, mortgage rates come down. More housing is being built. So hopefully there will be some improvements so that we can continue to have available housing for people to move into the state. We did see inflation ease. The expectations for this year are for the Fed to start lowering its target rate. Last year at this time, I was talking about how many times is the Fed going to increase rates. This year, it's how many times are they going to decrease rates. Possibly 325 basis point reductions in 2024. That was in their March projections. But we've seen inflation run a little bit hotter than it had been expected to. So it may be either later in the year that they start lowering rates, or it may be not as many reductions as was previously expected. We did see migration into the state continue in 2023 as we saw those population patterns returning to normal. That was a good sign. We want to see that continue even further. But we do also, I want to point out that we have, I always say this these days, that we have a higher than usual level of economic uncertainty. Maybe it's just a new baseline of higher economic uncertainty. But there's a lot of geopolitical upheaval globally right now, and it is a presidential election year, and both of those things add extra uncertainty to the economy. On the good news side of that, though, is that the state does have a robust budget stabilization fund. That's our rainy day fund. It's actually at its statutory maximum. It's around $970 million. That provides a very good cushion if something happens where the governor and the legislature have some wiggle room to make changes without having to sort of do drastic and sudden cuts. And there is still spending from the pandemic era infusion of federal funds. It feels like forever ago at this point, but actually a lot of the infrastructure spending is just starting this year. And that will provide some economic activity to the state as well. And both of those things will help the state weather any potential slowdown or reduction in revenues that's beyond what is expected. And I will share my slides as well, so those can be passed around. We also put a lot of stuff on our website, including presentation slides. We have a monthly economic indicators report. We are trying to add some other new and interesting visualizations and data tools. So it's a little bit work in progress at the moment, but check it out and feel free, if you have questions on anything, you can always send me an email as well. And I will stop sharing there and we can get to questions.
Thank you both. Thank you both. I mean, I have a lot of notes I took, and I'm sure the people that are watching probably did the same. So, and I appreciate both of you sharing those slides because it'll make it a lot easier for people. I think one of the big things that I paid attention to was the national number of, our unit sales being down. And I know in Maine, our numbers were a little bit different. I think our lowest, we were like 2005 versus 1995 nationally, but 100 million more people since 1995. And there lies the struggle, I think, is building those homes. And I think locally what we see is a lot of NIMBYism going on, and a lot of overregulation and restrictions that actually drive up the cost of building. So very interesting. Thank you both. And we're going to open it up to questions, and we'll go from there. Claire, what do you have?
So we just have a couple questions here. I think the first two are directed at you, Dr. Lautz. Thank you both. I have a ton of notes, as Paul said. So a question was about the, does NAR have any demographic percentages of who's paying cash in comparison to in-state, out-of-state, and where the cash influx is coming from?
Yeah, so I'm not able to actually break it down by a state level in that data. What I can say is that we know that there's more baby boomers who are paying cash. In fact, 2 years ago, it was 50% of older boomers were paying all cash. It's come down from that point. I suspect only because home prices have come up. That being said, we know that the typical down payment for older boomers is actually 35%, which is really sizable. That's going to offset the higher mortgage rate without question. So knowing that they have that much cash means that I suspect you're going to see more folks who are relocating, or people who are moving locally who are older are able to do that. We also know that people who are relocating for longer distances are more likely to pay all cash as well. So you know, the trope perhaps about New York City folks moving to Maine, or I'm in DC and I love your state. So I'd be happy to move there. Anyone who's moving from a, you know, a more expensive area to a more affordable area, certainly you're probably going to see that, though I don't think I could do that moving from DC. Regardless, we do see that long distance movers are more likely to.
And I think that this question probably lends right into that information. Regarding the cash buyers, does that reflect transactions where there was no financing contingency or just where only cash was used?
Yeah, this is a really solid question and one that I'm getting a lot. So I need to clarify that in the remarks period, but this goes beyond the contingency. So we're actually asking, did you finance the purchase versus did you place a financing contingency on the purchase? So very important, especially if there's an appraisal gap, anything along those lines. So yes, this is a pure all cash purchase as far as we can tell, at least.
Thank you. And I believe this one is for you, Amanda, regarding labor force in Maine. Is that work from home, which may not, you know, be meeting the labor demands and the shortages, or is there any information on that statistic?
The question about remote workers has been one that we've gotten a lot the past few years. Unfortunately, it is really, really hard to get any solid data on it. You know, I think that certainly we have seen an influx of people who are working remotely. I think also, though, we have seen employment grow more strongly than we expected it to with our given population. So I suspect at least some of those people are picking up something that is counting them in the state employment numbers. You know, a couple of different sources that we can look at for that. So in some of those, they may still be working remotely, but still being counted in Maine employment. So even if they're working for an employer that's out of state, and some of the other sources, it counts them a little bit differently. But I will say that our hope is that those folks who moved here to take remote job or to kept their remote jobs when they moved here are going to stay here, even as the sort of transition back to office happens for some of them. Either they'll be able to negotiate working remotely, or they will find something locally, or at least closer to home, so they don't all leave. I think the fact that we saw the 2023 numbers look the way they did was an indication that they didn't all leave. If they had, we probably would have seen our population growth slow a bit in 2023, which didn't happen. But we need to sort of balance the idea between, do we have those folks who are here working remotely? They're still contributing to their communities in other ways, and hopefully they're eventually going to join the labor force in some other way as well. It may also be that because they were working remotely, it allowed them to move here, and a partner or spouse was able to take a job locally. That for a lot of people had been a holdup in the past before remote work became so available. So I wish I had better numbers. I really do, because we get a lot of questions, and I'd like to have a better sense of that population. But it is something that we have been thinking about a lot.
Yep. And then we have just another one, and I don't know that we have this granular of information, but the source of state to state migration are the people that are coming to Maine. Where are they primarily coming from? Do we have that information?
So there are some state to state migration tables available from the census. They're from a different source. So what I use for those migration numbers is the population estimates program. Those are considered the official population estimates. The American Community Survey provides some data, and that's where the census does their state to state estimates from. It has very large margins of error, and some years they look pretty good, and we've struggled with the most recent. 2022 is the most recent one. We've struggled with those. I think that generally speaking, we tend to get more migration into the state from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, some of the nearby states, and then some of the larger states as well, just because they have so much population that, Texas, California, places like that, it shows up on those as well. But the most recent ones that we looked at, there was not much that we could look at and get reliable data from.
Do know, Main Listings does track things by, where the buyers came from zip codes. So there is some of that information available at Main Listings,
And I think
the agents have. Yeah.
historically in the last several years, we use this in our talking points for proposals regarding housing, that historically most of the migration within the state has been main zip code to main zip code. For our purposes, I think it's like around 70%. But we all know that there's migration as well. But Paul is correct, and some of that data is available internally. And I think
Yes.
that unless there's any other questions, we've answered all of the
Yep.
Q&A.
I do have one, and I guess this would be both on a national level and on a local. So Amanda, we'll start with you. As we mentioned about building more. And so do we have any numbers that sort of show, hey, whatever, 2010 to 2020, this is what we were building and versus what we're building now? Because I feel that, our numbers really aren't where they need to be.
There are building permits counts available from the census. I don't have a great sense of the reliability of those, but certainly it does show a period of time where we had relatively low rates of building permits being pulled. And then more recently, a little bit of an uptick. There's a lag in that data as well.
Yeah.
So I could look at them again. I haven't looked at them recently, but I think generally speaking, that has been the pattern where we had a period of time where it was pretty low. And then more recently, we've seen a little bit of an uptick. I agree, it's not as high as it needs to be. And the Maine Housing Production Needs Study that came out, I think it was October or November last year, did a pretty good evaluation of what hasn't been built in the past, to sort of that backfill need that we have, and then looking at what we need going forward to sort of fill job openings and population growth.
Thank you. And Dr. Lutz, the same thing. I know we get numbers probably from the National Association of Home Builders, and typically we need X amount of homes per year to be built. And we have basically just been hitting that number, haven't we? And we're 14 years or so behind, been underdeveloped. So how many homes is the current estimate that we are underdeveloped by, I guess, is my question.
So our estimate, and this is slightly older, and to Amanda's point, there has been more home building activity in the last year to 18 months. That being said, there is certainly a slower process than there has been historically. Historically, it takes about 6 to 9 months for a shovel into the ground to get a home really built. And that time period really expanded during the pandemic because of the supply crisis, labor crisis, everything, permitting, you name it. There were problems in getting those homes actually completed. That time frame seems to be shortening. All of that said, on a national scale, we're short by about 5.5 million homes. That's our estimate. So in Maine, knowing that you have a population growth there, migration flow patterns, I imagine inventory quite tight.
Thank you. Thank you both for being here. Really appreciate it. Are there any more questions, Claire?
We have wrapped them all up.
Okay, so we appreciate your knowledge and sharing the information with us. We're so thankful and grateful for both of you. I want to thank all the attendees for being here and remind them that the slides will be available both in our MAR e-news and also I think they'll be available on the MAR website. I can't thank you enough. Look forward to being able to do this again sometime soon with hopefully better news next year. So, but thank you all for attending and thank you. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you
Thank
both.
you. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.